We can't hear you, Oleg.
That was pretty funny. You agree?
It was just to get us laughing.
All right.
Well, it worked.
Well, welcome to everyone who's listening to another episode of
Just a
Squirrel
squirrel looking for a nut,
trying
to
get
out of this
rut.
95% there.
Yeah.
We're getting better after more than a year. Oleg, how are you?
And we couldn't have been perfect, because if we would have perfected that and not had the opportunity to not hear me for the first seconds, there's no way that could have been real life, right?
The day we're perfect is the day we will have found the nut and we will have gotten out of the rut, and then the show will end. So we'll make sure we always screw it up just a little bit. What now? Is there someone else in the house today? Are you hiding people, Oleg?
There is.
Oh, whoa, wow. Is this Matthew Fay?
It is indeed, Scott. How are you?
Good, Matthew. Are you occasionally known to crack a joke?
Occasionally, by every 30 seconds to a minute to an obnoxious degree. And yeah, that's my friends and family.
And you are part of a comedy troupe, is that not correct?
I am, yes. Prior to COVID, back when all the theaters were operating, I was a member of a group called the Walking Juxt, who performed at the People's Improv Theater, the now recently closed, unfortunately, People's Improv Theater. But we performed at the Pit Loft and the Pit Main Theater. But yes, and we're still together. We're still putting stuff up on our TikTok and things like that. So the band's not broken up yet, but yeah.
Well, if there is any prep for this sort of show that is right on target, it is improv. I see Melody is in the house. Melody, how are you? It is good to see you, and thank you for joining us yet again. We always love having you dial in from Massachusetts, and be sure to laugh a little bit today and have a good old time with us. I'm gonna start by saying I was walking around with sackcloth on my body today and just trying to look all dreary and trying to just be as sour and down and depressed as possible. And as I was stomping around, just looking all dreary, people on the street were laughing at me. I was like this big object of ridicule. What made me so funny? I was trying to be a downer Debbie, and people wouldn't let me. Before I knew it, I was laughing at myself. What, Matthew? Maybe you should start. What made you decide to try and be funny in the first place?
I was thinking about that, and so give you a little bit of background on me. The first time I officially started, quote unquote, doing comedy was back in high school. Actually, the first kind of ever venue or gig I did, so to speak, was I would go up and I would make announcements at basically our auditorium for a club I was doing, and I'd kind of just spin them into real kind of like routines or funny jokes and things like that. But before that, something I used to do was honestly, I loved comedy since I was at least like 10 years old. I can remember our mutual friend Duncan. I would just recite like George Carlin routines to him, and he'd find it the funniest thing in the world. And I tell him to actually go watch the routine instead of, having me recite them, because I promise he does it a lot better. So it's just, it's just been with me for a long time. My dad's a very funny guy. My mom's a very funny guy. My dad, I think my dad showed me like George Carlin routines way too young, like when he was, going full out swearing, things like that. But, it's hard for me to remember a time when I wasn't really into it. And I think all of that kind of enjoyment of it at one point just finally came together, and I figured, let's give it a try and see if I can, crack a joke in front of people. But yeah, it's kind of been with me my whole life, I think.
What do you think is the most challenging part about expressing your sense of humor?
Most challenging part, I think, just dealing sometimes with the fact that people are not buying this joke. It's the bombing, honestly. And it's taken me a while to get this way, but sometimes you crack a joke and either people don't get it or it doesn't land, and you just have to be like, okay, and bounce back and move on. And I think you just have to get to a point where Patton Oswalt talked about why he thinks everybody should bomb really badly one time. And it's because after that, like, you realize, oh, okay, that happened and I'm still here. So, it's not the worst thing in the world if you do a bunch of jokes and they don't land, and you can just kind of move on, try again later. So I think that's, for me, just getting to the point where I can do jokes and they don't work and I'm not just curling up into a ball afterward and feeling terrible about myself has been a development that it's taken me years to get to that point where I can just bomb and be like, okay, that didn't work, and then just move on and try again later. So I think just working up the courage to be like, to try something out and, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And just getting to that kind of very blasé attitude, I think, can take a while. And I don't think you ever fully get over it, but you can just get to a point where you can kind of just be functionally okay with it.
Mm-hmm. One thing that it made me think of as you were sharing this, I think this kind of directly relates, and Scott, feel free to share your insight about this as well. But I remember when I was talking to different public speakers, both Scott and I are in that space, and those who are a little bit more seasoned, they would oftentimes say you'll get to that point where their nerves no longer kick in or your stomach doesn't churn. And personally, I haven't experienced that because I think there's beauty in those moments. There's probably beauty in the moments where you're on the stage in front of however many people. It could be one person, it could be a group of people, and then you just completely bomb a joke because you thought it was the funniest thing ever to you, and the other person sitting there like, what's going on? Like, was that a ha ha ha?
Not supposed to laugh now.
So I find that the same exact thing with in regard to public speaking. I think that there's certain things that I don't believe ever leave. I think if anything, they might transform into something else. Like, I don't think the nerves are no longer the same as they used to be during the first gig or the 10th gig. But like that thing still happens to me, and I kind of try and embrace that as part of the journey, because I think there's a lot of confidence that could be built from that step moving forward, as well as courage that could be found.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I completely agree in that my nerves have never gone away. Like, even when I still go to mics, just like try out jokes, I still feel the nerves. And I agree. I don't think it ever really fully goes away, nor do I think it really should, because I think you're right. I think it is a very good motivating thing, just like to feel that sense of fear. Because I feel like if you weren't at all afraid of going up, then you'd feel like there's no real stake in it. If you didn't care at all went badly, it just goes, to me, it indicates that you're not really dedicated to wanting it to go well, whether it be public speaking or comedy. I think there's always a little part of you that should be a little bit afraid, just not so much that it prevents you from going up. So I think there is an ability to manage fear as a powerful motivator, just not in a way that completely eliminates your ability to do it.
It does sort of go as to the quote that Melody put in the comments about showing up and being seen when there are no guarantees. And speaking, there's no guarantees. I will never forget that last year at one point, I spoke before a certain organization. I remember talking to you about this, Oleg, and I don't know that I totally bombed. I was told that the people in the audience were riveted the whole time that they were looking, but the host of the event made it clear that he wasn't having him some Scott Mason that night. And I'll never forget the minute I was done, he was like, yeah, thank you, click, and got rid of me so fast. It wasn't even funny. And that was one of those things where I was like, I had never really outright bombed before, and I was upset about it. But it's one of those things where I feel like you'd sort of have to learn with it. You toughen up by having dealt with it. But the other thing too is, at some point after I got over the initial ego shock and humiliation, because when you're in any sort of public situation, humiliation is just part of the game. Shame, disgrace, falling face first into a mud puddle. That's just your day-to-day life. Then it gave me the opportunity to sit back and say, well, really, what did I not do well? Why might he have been so irritated with me? And there are things that I've changed with regards to my speaking because of that experience.
Scott, when you think about your personality, what makes you funny?
Am I funny?
Are you funny?
I don't know. I try to be, but I don't know that I always succeed. I think I'm more funny in that people enjoy laughing at me. I don't know if they're always laughing with me. I suppose that can be funny. What'd you say?
I think that's part of it. I mean, people always say it's better to laugh with you than at you. I don't know. I feel like it's part of the game, is being laughed at too. I wouldn't exclude it. It's a lot.
Yeah, I did learn one time. So I was inducted into my high school Hall of Fame a few years ago, and they did this intro of me. And one of the things they said during the intro was Scott, it wasn't these exact words, but they said Scott was very enigmatic. We asked around and no one knew anything about him. So I realized I was totally obscure. That was a come down. But not only that, but one moment I had where I was the center of the universe in high school was when we were having my favorite dish in the world for lunch that day, hot chili. And I had on my best brown disco shirt and my new designer jeans and some penny loafers. I thought I was looking more badass than anybody. Mm-hmm. And there I was. They had just shined the floor, and I went down into the chili. And I stood up, my disco shirt, my hands, my face were all just looking like chili. There was probably a bean stuck right here. And I got an applause. Everyone was laughing at me, but at least I existed for a moment.
You walked it off.
So you weren't feeling so hot that day. Is that what I understand?
Well, I was feeling hot to the extent that chili burned my tender little cheeks.
Quite literally hot.
But yeah, I wasn't feeling hot like like a hot rod human being. No.
I've had moments like that happen, and I'm curious if this happens to either of you two or Melody or anyone else that's tuning in. But do you ever have these moments in life where, let's say, you're heading somewhere, whether it's any form of professional engagement, grocery store, whatever the place is, and you're drinking something on the way, and out of all of the possible places it could spill, it spills exactly, exactly where it spills. It spills there. And I've always tried to understand, like, how does that happen? Because here I am I'm observing how I'm even sitting. Like, in order for me to spill there, the cup literally has to go like this, somehow make it. And that to me just always blows me away. And I find that to be the funniest thing, because it's one of those situations where it's like, I mean, I don't carry an extra pair of shorts or pants. And maybe I should. Maybe that's the lesson that I'm learning from those. But yet here I am always faced with it, not always, but relatively often faced with that situation. And every time I walk in, I always try and create a story. So I was driving here and blah, blah, blah happened. And then here's what you see as the result. But like, I wonder, like, how, that's one of those things about life that I don't know if I'll ever understand. Like, how does that happen?
Yeah.
In the most unlikely positions, or, I remember one time I was standing at a light, kid you not, like fourth or fifth person back. That's quite the distance from the street. And it was raining, I think, the night before, and there was a huge puddle. Car drives over it. Literally gets exactly the first 5 or the first 4 people in that line. Doesn't get anyone behind me. Gets solely me and the 3 or 4 people in front of me. Like, how?
I am of the thorough opinion that there is the laws of physics, and then there's a separate laws of physics for public humiliation, and with things just twist and turn in almost an Inception-like way to just humiliate you personally. I totally agree with that. I'm sure we've all been in a situation where, I don't know if you've ever had to like wear a suit jacket over a coffee stain on the way to an interview. You're kind of like holding it like this. Like, yes, I'm very qualified to be here.
And I feel very confident right now.
It's cold in here, but
tired.
Right. It's the middle of July.
But no, I mean, I completely agree. I think sometimes it just feels like the world operates against you, whether it be a car splashing through a puddle or coffee behaving in a way it definitely should not. Yeah, I've been in plenty of situations like that. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, but I've honestly probably repressed all of them. So give me a minute, I'll probably think of one.
Well, Melody says she can relate. She says, basically that sometimes it does seem that way, Matthew, and maybe sometimes there's a little bit of karma out there. Maybe not the big stuff, but maybe you've been just a little bit too big for your britches, and the universe needs to bring you down just a notch. Now, go ahead, Oleg.
Do you think we attract such circumstances?
Maybe I was a little bit too vain wearing that disco shirt.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the universe is like, you can't pull off that shirt.
Exactly. Maybe the universe was like, disco died 4 years ago. You need to stop. Get some new clothes.
But I get curious sometimes, like how many of these circumstances do we attract, and obviously everyone's going to have their own beliefs, but I wonder when I was reflecting back upon some of these things that I thought were just hysterical in a moment or after it took place, and I thought about it, it's like, what actually attracted that? Was it the time that I got pissed off at the driver in front of me for not going fast enough when I was trying to get to the same exact place as that person was? Or all of these other things? And I don't know if there is a concrete way of knowing. I don't know if anyone's ever going to knock on my door and say, hey, the 50 times that this happened to you, here's the reasoning for each and every single one of them. But I just get curious sometimes, like, to what degree do we attract the circumstances that we go through?
Matt,
we're both waiting for the other one to go.
Can't we just turn this over to you and then come up with a snappy retort?
I mean, that's a spiritual, profound question that I feel like we've been trying to answer since the beginning of time. Because I am a believer to a certain extent in karma, if only in that, you know, if you are going to behave like a jerk out in the world, like at some point it's going to come back to bite you. If not through new laws of physics, then just the way people are towards you. Yeah, just I believe, like, look, if you treat people like dirt, like, it's eventually people are gonna feel a certain way about you, and it's gonna come back and bite you. Maybe they'll, I don't know, pull your chair out from your desk in a certain way. I don't know. Just like, you know, I feel like just your behavior reflects back on you, even if you think it won't. So I think that, I mean, that's part of it. I don't think, for example, I mean, in the case of the car, I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I was mean to someone and they tracked me down for a week in their car and followed my schedule and calculated the puddle to the exact. I mean, that's a lot of effort, and that's like a revenge thriller degree of effort to for somebody. But I do believe that, you know, you receive what you give out into the world. I feel like, you know, if you're going to behave badly, it will come back to like you again. Just it depending on who you treat well and who you treat poorly, eventually you're going to treat the wrong person badly, and I don't know, like they'll try to get back at you somehow. I don't know. I feel like, yeah, whether that be just like people to people interaction, chaotic energy. I try to be as decent as I can out in the world so it doesn't come back to bite me in that way.
Well, I've got to ask something about that, though, in the context of humor. One way that people can be very mean to each other is through humor. And why I've learned to try and not be making fun of people all the time is that really it is behavior that comes back to you. And if you don't like being made fun of and humiliated in that respect, which I don't, sometimes I like people laughing at me, but sometimes I really, really don't, then maybe you start by not using that sort of humor in life. But then I also sometimes wonder, like, to what extent is laughing, though, at another person really bad or a problematic form of humor or not? And here's an example that I will share, and you all may or may not find this humorous. One day I was walking down Broadway here in New York City, which is, as I'm sure anyone watching or listening to this knows, a major thoroughfare. And about 5 feet in front of me was a couple, and they were dressed up. The man looked like he was in a suit, and I was behind them, and he had his hair all glamorous and glossy, and with him was this beautiful, glamorous woman that was in an expensive dress and heels, and her hair was all coiffed and this, that, and the other. And then as I was walking behind her, I suddenly heard this thunderous noise come from her rear side, and then a particular fume filled the air. And I started laughing because there seems something incongruous about this glamorous woman and this sensation, this set of sensations that I was experiencing. So I started to laugh. Was I a bad person inviting karma at laughing at this woman and what the gift she had brought into my world?
In many ways, the gift. I think so. How I think about that, because I find myself in similar situations where I see people pass what appears to be natural gas, which I do. I just don't do it. You know,
I don't.
With a performance like that, I do more of a toned down orchestra, like, you know, single layer. But so I find, for me personally, I find that to be funny, and I will laugh. I don't know if I'm laughing at the person or with the person or at the situation itself. Because I think that's also possible. I think it's also possible to express humor at the situation without associating with the person or looking down upon them. To me, those moments, I find them hysterical. And the reason why is because I think all of us do it. I remember one time I was talking to a couple of my friends. They were all girls, and what they told me is supposedly they don't let the natural gas out. I'm like, okay, come on, like, what do you do with it? Like, do you have a special processor that like composes it and like sends it some other way? Like there's
Plug it in a jar and just like.
But I find that to be funny, and I find some of the other things that I think all of us probably do, but more so the things that I do. And then seeing that in someone else is like, wow, that was really ridiculous. But at the same time, it's like, I probably do the same thing every single day. I remember times, this doesn't happen to me that often anymore, although I kind of stopped paying attention to it. So maybe it does. But have you ever had a time where you get out of bed in the morning and you're still sleepy and you put on socks the wrong way? Like you put the left on the right and you feel the difference? Because
Yes,
you wore a sock for so long, and it's like all of a sudden your toes in just in different positions. Or sometimes I wore random socks, and somehow my mind processed that as the same pair. And then I'll go into a meeting and like people thought it was funny, and I kind of played along with it. I made them think that I intentionally created that, only to realize I was sitting behind there thinking like, damn, I really put on the wrong pair of socks, and I thought I had two of the same exact pair.
Melody had a wonderfully spirited comment about the glamorous woman that gave me a gift. I love that you are able to forgive me for my sin of laughter, Melody, and you can relate to me with empathy. Matthew, would you have laughed, or would you have just gone on your way and allowed her to have her dignity?
I mean, I forget who said it, but I feel like it's a kind of consensus among many comedians. I heard say in an interview one time, if you don't find farts funny, you don't have a soul. Like that's just a thing that everybody finds funny. I mean, I don't know anybody who wouldn't laugh at that. I mean, clearly you don't want to laugh in their face about it. You don't want to like stop them and laugh at them in their face. I mean, that's just reading the room, So you kind of chuckle to yourself. But yeah, I mean, I would have laughed at that. I would have maybe made sure I was out of earshot, but I absolutely would have laughed at that. But I don't know. I don't know if anybody who I know who wouldn't have found that funny. It's a fart. It's funny. Like, come on. Yeah. So no, I would have found it funny, but I also do agree that you do have to consider. I mean, plenty of comedians don't, I think, and consider people's feelings. The entire concept of crowd work is making fun of people regardless of how they feel about it. But they were also at a comedy show, so they, I guess, knew it was a possibility. But I also do believe in considering people's feelings and whether or not, maybe I had a funny thought. If it's gonna hurt someone's feelings in the room, I'll reconsider it. I don't want to make someone feel bad for the lulz, and sometimes it's not worth it.
Not to continue the fart conversation, but do either
of you... please continue the fart conversation.
Yeah, we'll talk about that all night.
Yeah, this is some gold material here. But do either of you find it funny, the fact that everyone does it differently? Everyone has a different sound?
Is it like your fingerprint? Like you can identify somebody by their farts?
I don't know if it's that specific, but I certainly don't recall it to memory with each person.
Well, maybe...
We tracked down the serial killer by his farts.
I was going to say,
maybe we should mystery.
Yeah, maybe we should create some special police forensic unit where they have fart identifiers and they question everyone who might have been a witness.
I don't know who'd be lining up for that job, but it was always my dream to be a flatulent forensic scientist,
fart investigator.
I was a boy.
Well, what I love sometimes is the way that you're not able to, people like get in this mass denial about who it was, and that it is you. So one time there was a blackout here. I can't believe I'm going to confess this on TV or on live stream, but I don't think anyone will hold it against me. I just hope I'm never exposed publicly. But there was a blackout here in New York City and everyone had to walk home. So I was in downtown Manhattan. I had to walk something like 100 blocks to get to my house. And it was so hot and the streets were crowded with people as everyone was tromping home. And I had some lunch and there was a crowded intersection down in Chinatown. And I was with a group of very glamorous, dolled up women. They were the sort that really, they loved to wear their nails and they had the hair and everything, the heels, and I felt bad for them. They had really glamorized themselves that day and were having to walk home in their wigs and in their nails and in their heels and in their tight jeans and all that sort of stuff. And as we approached this intersection, it was just chock full of people. I couldn't help it. It was silent, but I had a moment of extreme release. And then I tried to slide by, but I heard one of them stop. And she looked around and she said to her girlfriends, "Someone farted." And I just kept sliding away. I just walked away like nothing was going on. But even inside, I had to laugh at myself.
Yeah.
We've all done it. You don't have to feel guilty.
That's happened to me on airplanes before.
Oh, airplanes.
Well, that's a more confined space.
Yeah, though that's a hard, for me, that's a difficult space to confront myself for doing it. Because I'm already like this, especially in the middle, and which I think, looking back and I know maybe it's not my fault solely because I'm squished and everything's being pushed down, not up, and it just comes out sometimes. But it's not like I'm going to raise my hand and then apologize to the whole airplane,
But, getting back to the topic of the forensic fart police,
yeah,
that does raise an issue, which is how we learn how to control passing gas. Because over time, if you're really skilled, you have the ability many times to be able to discipline yourself so that it can come out silently and sneakily and in a controlled sort of way. You can be a phantom gas releaser.
Yeah.
And that to me is some high level gaseousness there as opposed to the more juvenile and undisciplined, loud, uncontrolled obscenities that people subject themselves to.
Here's another question, and for two of you or Melody or anyone else, does all gas smell bad?
I have wondered if there are people that secretly love it. And I've wondered if there were to be, for instance, an aromatic candle that was fart smell, if people would buy that. I remember when I grew up in the Midwest, there were people that loved the smell of gasoline, and Melody just, in a word, says no.
That's a definitive no. Gasoline, maybe.
But I also find, like, in those situations, why I don't sometimes find those situations to be funny, because, I mean, many of us do it. Probably all of us do it, right? In one way or another. Some are silent, others like an orchestra and everything in between. But I really get curious, like, why has that part not been accepted for what it is, and it's just like a natural form of life? I mean, I don't know, if you really gotta go, you gotta go. What do you do? If you suppress it, then you get all kinds of things. It's
in
like
the ancient Roman go ahead.
I was gonna say, it's the same way, like one of my friends, I think it was back in college, he used to force himself not to pee sometimes for whatever circumstances. Well, however many years later, he got kidney stones.
Ooh, yeah.
And so it's like, I wonder, like, what happens when you hold the other thing?
What's the fart equivalent of kidney stones?
Yeah, it's got to, like, come back around. If it
It
doesn't
all
go
comes back.
anywhere, it goes somewhere, right?
Maybe you get exploded intestines.
I
I'm
don't
not a gastroenterologist, but I'm assuming it's some negative health effects. I'll have to.
Gastroenterologist.
Whatever it's called, I may have just butchered that name. I know it's something.
I love it. If someone doesn't have that profession,
Yeah.
take it while it's available.
I mean, hey, look, somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to, treat this. I'm sure that guy deals with this all the time. He just tells people not to hold it in, to just let it fly. It's weird because, like, I think about, like, my upbringing. My dad was like a proud public flatulator, shall we say. Like just like, you know, would just walk through the living room and let one loose and keep going and be like a drive-by farts. And he was just like proud of that. Like he never had any qualms about doing it in front of his kids, in front of his wife. I assume he did it at the office too. Not so much anymore, but like, you know, when I was a kid, like I was just, you know, that's just something that happened. My dad would walk into the room and he would farts. But yeah, so I don't know. I was never like instructed, like, you know, Matt, when you're in school, don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of any particular instances in which I got in trouble for doing that, or like when I really felt embarrassed by it. I think I was just kind of, if it ever did happen to me, I was probably just sneaky about it. But like, yeah, I also don't distinctly remember any times where like my dad sat me down and said like, listen, like in a birds and the bees kind of way, he like sat me down and talked to me about like how to control public flatulence. So, I mean, you know, clearly for boys and girls, and it might be different. I don't know. Like it just wasn't part of my upbringing. It was very out in the open with my dad. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like, you know, it's something your body does. I don't know why we have condemned it so thoroughly. He also tells a story about, because my dad's a lawyer, and there was one time where he was at a conference or something, and like this is also a joke in the movie I saw. It's just like it's a common example of something funny happening. Somebody had their mic attached to their shirt when they went to the bathroom. And so while someone else was talking, somebody, you know, let one loose into their mic, and it just blown out over the audience. And to him, he's like, it's one of the funniest things he's ever heard. So I don't know, just like, I feel like, you know, you control as much as you can in the same way that you wouldn't like let loose a huge burp in the middle of a conference meeting. You know, you try as well as you can to cover your mouth and whatnot. There are basic standards of politeness that you follow, but otherwise, like, yeah, like it's not worth condemning somebody for life over it, I think.
Melody saying that there was a lecture that some folks got in a particular time and place. I grew up in a household where my mother was one of the people that didn't do such an obscene, nasty little thing, and my dad just didn't talk about it. But I think we got in trouble if we did. You know, I think the main place where
what'd you have to do? Fart
what'd
more?
You say?
What'd you have to do? Fart more?
No, I mean, I will say the times that I tended to get in trouble most, but it somehow seemed to be the most funny, was if my sister and I or someone else farted in church. Just like I would, and then my mother would reach over and, you know, smack our thoughts. Don't. But it was also sort of funny, for instance, because it was sort of poking fun at something I thought was absurd. We had these hymn books at church, and they had all of these hymns that were written hundreds of years ago. They were all, I went to an African American church. And yeah, I wanted the music to be good. And the choirs were good. It was some awesome music that was worth getting up and going to church for. But those hymns, when the audience or the congregation had to pull up these rickety old things and start to sing it, that stuff was boring. And so I loved to really sing the hymns in this over-the-top, exaggerated gospel way, because the choirs in my church, sometimes they would have like these gospel singers, and I thought that was an awesome way to make fun of these old hymns, to sing them like I was an over-the-top male version of Mahalia Jackson. Or sometimes I would sing, they had these opera women that loved to sing things like they were Kathleen Battle. And so I would sing with this over-the-top, loud, operatic voice. And for whatever reason, maybe it was the seriousness or the stodginess of these hymns, but whenever I overdid it, people would be rolling on the floor. And even my parents, who were supposed to be mad at me about it, found themselves giggling under their breaths. Why would that be funny? Somebody tell me.
That's probably a conversation you have with the parents first.
I mean, I've always found that it's kind of a human instinct in moments of very deep seriousness to want to lighten things with humor. I mean, I think that's kind of the whole purpose of dark humor. If you ever watch a TV show or have had a comedian who's made fun of something like being in church, or who's, you know, even like darker subjects like funerals, to me, there's something psychological about being in a situation where it's almost like a childhood rebellion instinct. Like, you have to be serious here, no joking around. It's kind of like, don't think of an elephant. What are you going to do? Think of an elephant. So tells you be serious. What are you going to do? Or at least have an instinct to do is be silly. So I don't know. I think it is a very instinctual thing. It harkens back to childhood. And yeah, I mean, church, where else are you told to behave more and to be more serious than in church? I also just love the image, by the way, Scott, of you belting these hymns like you're at a concert in, wherever. Just that's a delightful image to me. So I think that's a totally natural feeling. Whether or not you act on that feeling is different, but I feel like most people have felt the need to bring a certain levity to a serious situation with silliness.
Why do people? So I got to speak from my perspective. I think throughout my own life, one of the things that I've realized is the same exact thing that you were talking about, Matt, and that's the concept of being serious. And I've been curious for as ever long I can remember or became aware of this topic. Why is that the way? Why are so many of us taught to be serious? What does that actually provide? Like, what does that give in life? When the reality, I think the same could be gained from, at least for me, the same could be gained from funny situations. In fact, I think the times when I spend laughing and not taking the situation in complete seriousness. Now, don't get me wrong. There's certain situations that probably do need to have their own level of seriousness. If you have to pay a bill, and you can make it funny to yourself, but whoever you're paying it to, like, they're not gonna ha-ha with you. They're gonna say, hey,
Yeah.
Where's your card? Like, we need to get to the next person. But there are other situations where I've had conversations with people, and through laughter, I felt more at ease and more at peace by being with them and not taking whatever the situation we're talking about in a serious fashion. And I'm curious, just when it comes to life, just from your perspectives and what you've learned throughout your own journey, why is that the route that so many of us are taught? Be this, but don't be that.
Who are these people that always demand that we be serious anyway? Who gave boring people the right to rule the world? That's always annoyed me. I remember when I went to college, there was this opening. The very first thing we had was this convocation at the college chapel. The entire class had to go in, and the deans came up and gave these speeches, and they were academicians, so that used to be a legitimate excuse. Ain't an excuse anymore. Well, it really wasn't even an excuse then. And they would sit up there and they would drone on using this pompous voice tone, talking really flat, using all of these Latin words and exquisite phrases, long-winded, multiple turns and curves of speech. And by the time one of them was over and you thought relief was in sight, no, another one had to stand up and then drone on and on and on. Who said that these people needed to be the ones? Why couldn't we have had the Matthew Fays that grew up giving the speech and at least giving us the power of having our eyes open? Why are we subjected to boredom all the time?
Scott, how do I become a part of that club?
The boring club? Yeah. Teach me. I've been told I am boring. So maybe I have a secret initiation rite that I forgot about because I was bored.
Who thinks you're boring?
You.
I think you're. I mean, aside from the total buzzkill who introduced you at that one event, I've never heard of anybody think of you as boring. So that's news to me.
I've worked at it. Do you struggle and strive and work hard every day to not be boring, Matt?
Me? I mean, I'd like to think I don't have to work too hard to not be boring. Boy, I really got to work on not being boring today. I hope I hope it's more instinctual. Boy, that'd be a real bummer if you had to get up and do your daily not being boring exercises before you walk out the door. It's interesting, the idea of seriousness versus humor. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, life is too serious to be taken seriously. Basically, life is so serious you can't not laugh at it. And that kind of speaks to me about part of the appeal of humor, which is releasing the tension from knowing how serious life can be, which is, I think, I just think it's without the ability to laugh, I just don't think most people could get through the day. I just, on a daily basis, there are just so many stresses in life, bills, jobs, God, right now, especially, God knows what else, it's just, things are so serious that if you didn't find a way to release the tension, I think we would all just go crazy. And I think that's part of the appeal and part of the gift of being able to find humor, even in small situations. It's like, for example, I think it's, for example, the past couple of funerals I've been to, not a funny situation. Somebody you love and know has passed away. And yet at those funerals, some of the people who went up to speak about the person were riffing on them. We're like making jokes about, like, remember, I'll tell you a story back on, when so-and-so, they found a way to find a certain amount of joy in this incredibly painful situation. My grandfather's funeral, my uncle was telling stories about him. I unfortunately had a friend pass away a number of years ago. His sister was riffing on him at his funeral. And I was astonished that she had the strength to do that. But I was also kind of in awe of her ability to do that, to the ability to find joy, because the person that she was talking about was also a very funny guy. This was somebody who loved to make people laugh, loved to joke with people. And so in her mind, part of respecting who this person was acknowledging his love for releasing that kind of stress. And I think the way she put it was, he wouldn't want us to be bummed out here. He wouldn't want us to just be miserable the whole time. He would want us to, be able to have a certain amount of joy in it. So I think at times it can be very difficult to laugh at things. And I don't think you should ever feel like you have to laugh at things, particularly when things are very hard. But I think it is just a human instinct to try and alleviate a lot of the stresses and pains that we experience on a regular basis. I think that's, if not the primary appeal, then one of the biggest appeals of being able to joke and of humor in general.
Melody says that laughter is good for your mind and body. I will agree, except when I'm laughing so hard that my head hits the floor. What do we think of the concept, though? One of my heroes, Weird Al Yankovic,
Oh my God!
Are you pro Weird Al, Matt and Oleg?
Wait, who's anti Weird Al? Is there like an anti Weird Al camp where they're just like, nah, I can't stand this guy?
I know they've got some serious problems.
Then I won't reveal my views. Keep going.
Oh, this show just ended.
Like, you're not going to see Weird Al get canceled anytime soon.
I know, right? Maybe that would be like the final way to end cancel culture.
Yeah.
What'd you say? Oh, but anyway, sorry about that. I might have accidentally talked over you, Matt. Weird Al had the best album cover, or the album title ever. It's called "Mandatory Fun." Do we think that you saw? Do you think there's such that should ever be mandatory to have fun?
I mean, getting back to my theory of people rebelling, I think if you tell people you have to have fun here, they're not going to have fun. Like, to me, mandatory fun sounds like, now listen, I know you're not on the best terms with your sister, but it's her wedding, so I'm requiring you to have fun here. But I mean, mandatory fun, I think there's a benefit to telling people you have to have fun here. If it's like, for example, I know I've been in situations where, I don't know, maybe post-breakup or something, I'm just in a really foul mood and I just don't feel like having a good time. I just feel like stirring in my own misery. I've had friends come out and say to me, like, you're coming out to get a drink, you have to have fun tonight. I think that's a situation where, it is beneficial to encourage said person to try and have fun at least. I don't think you should ever force fun on somebody, like if they really just don't want to have it. But I think there are times when people, all they need is a little bit of encouragement to feel better. Again, I think of that situation when, like, I don't know, I just need somebody to perk me up a bit. Or like, they're like, hey, let's watch a movie. You seem like you had a bad day at work. So maybe not mandatory fun, but like encouraged fun, recommended fun, kind of soft sell fun. Like, hey, you don't have to have fun, but you might like this. So I think so I guess that's what I think of when I think of like mandatory fun. When a friend who is looking out for you is like, listen, you're going to have fun tonight. I don't care. I'm tired of watching you, I'm trying to watch you be miserable after, you have to move on from this breakup or whatnot. That's what I think of, is just somebody who's like kind of affectionately telling their friend that you have to have fun because I want you to, feel a little bit better.
Do you intentionally create situations in your day where you try to laugh?
Do I? Yeah, I would say I do to an obnoxious degree. I'm riffing jokes during like meetings about the budget for next month. Not a very funny subject. And then I'll like crack, like, I don't know. You ever try out your bits on like the head of your budget agents? I don't know. Just like,
I don't know if I would have the same accountant if I tried that strategy.
I mean, I have to be gentle. I started a new job a couple months ago, and so I'm kind of like figuring out how many jokes I can get away with in a meeting, and they're not like bad jokes. I'll just like riff on like something. But I like, if we're having a meeting about just very basic, like, hey, this month's budget just came in, we need to update all of our spreadsheets. I'll find a way to try and make it funny at times. Just like, I don't know. I think it's just an instinct for me because I grew up in a very silly household, and all my brothers are silly, and my dad is silly, and my mom is silly. I think just it was kind of ingrained in me from a very early age to tastefully look for situations where you can insert a joke or kind of crack things up. So yeah, I mean, clearly, again, I really, the term I like to use is read the room, or in this case, read the Zoom meeting.
Read the room, read the Zoom.
Read the meeting. Like, I don't know.
It's a good play on words. I like it.
If the head of your agency is like upset at you, you're not going to try and make it crack a joke when you're being. I mean, thankfully we haven't had anything like that. But if it were a situation where somebody is like really saying like, "Hey guys, you really got to improve on this," I probably wouldn't crack a joke then. That doesn't help anybody.
But I have been in situations where I've been cracking jokes in an executive situation, and even with the bosses laughing, he might be laughing and he'll say, it'll be more like, okay, we have to get serious now, as opposed to actually getting angry because we're laughing and having fun. Although I have had bosses that just generally didn't like people to have fun, and it was almost like something out of a Joan Crawford movie where you'd be innocently playing. You'd feel like the kids innocently playing in the playground and having joy and throwing balloons around and tossing brightly colored balls, and then all into the air, and then all of a sudden darkness fills the door, and it's boss XYZ, and you can almost hear the background music.
Do you guys think, so as two of you were sharing, I was thinking about this topic in regard to sense of humor, and I'm curious to hear anyone's perspective on this, but do you think everyone has a sense of humor? Because I've been in situations where I've come across people who not only didn't appear to have it, but they said it themselves that they didn't have it. So it really got me curious as far as to what degree is a sense of humor a learned behavior, and to what degree are we born with it? Like, do we all have it, or do we learn it over time?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it's weird. I've never really thought about that all that much, but I guess it would have to be something that you learn over time. I don't know any hilarious babies, I guess. I mean, they're cute.
You haven't seen the E-Trade commercials yet?
I guess there are those. Those ones always kind of disturb me a bit. Are we talking about the E-Trade babies?
Yeah, the guy in the plane, he's like, Dad? I mean, I guess it is something that has to be learned. I guess it is something you kind of develop over time based on the kind of senses of humor you're exposed to. I know people who like, there's I forget who it was, but I was listening to somebody who was talking about like, where people got their senses of humor based on the kind of humor they grew up with. And he was talking about how he was of the generation that grew up on The Simpsons. And so how, for example, The Simpsons helped form their sense of humor based on like, so maybe they have a more absurd sense of humor. Whereas if maybe you grew up with It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, you have a darker sense of humor. I think it is something that you kind of, I think like a fart, it is specific to you. You kind of develop it, over time. But it is interesting though, because I think it is based on who you grow up with. Like if you don't grow up with particularly funny parents, although I know people who have parents who are not especially funny and they are hysterical. So I think it's like anything else. You kind of learn it from the people that you interact with, whether it be friends you went to school with. Like maybe your parents weren't very funny, but maybe your friends in high school were hilarious and you learned it from them.
or maybe there's a teacher who you found really funny. So I just think it is kind of something you build up over the years, and I think it can change. I think my sense of humor when I was 15 is very different from the way it is now, and that could just be through life experience or the kind of humor that makes you laugh. There's I forget who said it, but there's a rule in among stand-up, which the rule is write the jokes that you like and keep the jokes that they like, and that's it's all about what do you find funny and what makes you laugh is the first judgment of whether this joke is funny. But whether that joke is funny to you depends on your sense of humor. So, and that's why bombing exists, because sometimes the audience's sense of humor doesn't match your sense of humor, and that's just kind of the case sometimes. But I do think it is something that you kind of build up over the years through the things that bring you joy, but also the people you hang out with.
I do wonder to the extent to which there is a cultural and temporal element to this too. Mm-hmm. So, well before I was born, there was a show that was very popular. Matt, you may know about this. I doubt, Oleg, you do. I would be very shocked if Melody does not know about this. And other people who watch this show regularly also probably know about this. It's called the Carol.
Me old? Are you calling me old? Is that
You're the one with all the gray hair, Oleg. I know you dye that. So there was a show called the Carol Burnett Show.
Yes.
And everyone would, before I was born, would roll on the they just could not stop laughing. She would stand up on screen, and she had this little comedy troupe that was on every episode, and it was just hilarity defined. And then I decided to watch some reruns of that a few years ago. And I remember not laughing, distinctly not laughing. Melody does remember Carol Burnett. I remember sitting there looking, number one. Number two, thinking, this is totally corn cone. What in the heck? This is totally ridiculous. It's ridiculous, but not in a humorous way. It was just plain it wasn't funny. And then Carol Burnett herself was a guest star on a comedy, and I guess they wanted to promote her as this living comedy legend on this comedy show. I think it was at the time it's called Mad About You or something like that. Friends, one of these. And she did her shtick. And the studio audience seemed to be rolling in the aisles. Maybe they were having mandatory fun. I was like, this is totally like Groucho Marx suddenly appearing on Seinfeld. It was totally dated, totally something my great-great-great-grandmother would have found humorous. I could not relate. So to what extent do we think these things that are hilarious will date? And that our own sense of humor will make us feel dated?
Well, I think for me, going to your question, I think kind of going back to maybe even Matt's point as well, is sense of humor. It's so subjective. It's just like whatever's funny to me may not be funny to you and may not be funny to somewhere else or to someone else. I used to, when I would come home from school, especially in high school, maybe starting in middle school, I used to watch 2.5 Men religiously. I'm talking episode after episode after episode after episode after episode. And I found that show to be hysterical. Charlie Sheen and all the different things that they would create in that, I found that to be very, very funny. And then I remember having situations where my friends would walk in and they would sit with me 30 minutes, and I could tell that they were sitting not in joy and excitement, but in deep, deep suffering, because nothing that was being said was funny to them. And so that's where I kind of realized that it's sense of humor, it's such an interesting concept, and I don't know how it develops. Maybe it does follow a similar path, just like all the other habits, the average of the 5 or the average of all the interactions and the people. But the interesting component that I find within sense of humor is that even though other people's sense of humor influence mine, there is still something unique about my own that no one else has. I remember recently I was sitting down, and it's okay, no one has this laughter. Where did I get it from? How am I able to release it? No one has, well, Scott knows me in somewhat of a light like this, but the people that really know me, like my, middle schools and high schools, best friends, I have a very different sense of humor with them. And so that's where, like, I just find it fascinating. Like, how does that form? How did I tap into that? Maybe the influences help me tap into it and help me get comfortable with it. But yet the components that make up that sense of humor, it's nothing that any of the other people have. So that's where it gets me like really curious, like what actually contributes to that topic?
Well, and that goes us to Melody's remark. You have to have the right sense of humor for 2.5 Men. And then she also mentions that she didn't like Carol Burnett either, which I'm actually relieved to hear that. Melody, it makes me love you just a little bit more. But she did like I Love Lucy. Now, I was prepared when I was forced to have fun by some friends to watch I Love Lucy. I was prepared to be bored out of my mind. Nothing about that appealed to me. But there was one episode, I think it's a famous one, where she had to eat some food that was supposed to be delicious, but it was really garbage. And her facial expressions, I have to say, I was rolling on the floor laughing. So I am more pro Lucille Ball than some of these other things. Matt, do you study these old comedians? And what do you think about what Oleg is saying about picking up these habits? And please don't tell me you're trying to pick up habits and be like someone on the Carol Burnett show, or are you?
No, it's interesting because there's this idea, among people who are trying to work in comedy, whether it be writing or performing or whatnot, that you have to study like all the legends, like all like the greats, like you have to go back to the beginning of comedy. And yet, if you look at a lot of comedy writers nowadays, a lot of them have never seen Carol Burnett or they've never seen I Love Lucy. They just grew up with a different comedy atmosphere. So, I mean, there are old shows that I watch. I like the Marx Brothers. I like a lot of that old stuff. But it's like anything else. It's, if it appeals to you, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I seem to like watching the Carol Burnett show. I remember watching a bit of it, and I enjoyed it. But what I'm thinking of, for example, is also very early George Carlin was very goofy. It was very just like, yeah, but notice how an orange looks like this and blah, blah, blah. And it's very goofy and cartoony. And then if you watch George Carlin and like his last specials, he gets very serious. He's talking about like the deep subjects like religion and like death and all that. So it's really fascinating to see, even within one comedian's career, how much their own sense of humor changes, I think by necessity and also probably just out of interest. Like the George Carlin of his very later years was still a very funny man, but like you could tell he really just had some serious stuff. And so in terms of like the older stuff, yeah, I kind of pick and choose it like a lot of people. I'm trying to think of like some other old TV shows that I watch, probably like Marx Brothers, even my friend Jared recommends a lot of old British comedy shows, called the Two something or others. I'm forgetting the name of it. But yeah, or even like old Monty Python, I still find very funny. I think, it's all just about like what you can pick and choose at, because I love like absurd, goofy humor, but I also love dark humor. I have kind of a mixture of things in my own distinct sense of humor. And I think that gets back to your own sense of humor, which I think is a bit of like a quilt pattern. Yeah, maybe you and your friend were both exposed to the same comedy growing up, but maybe you processed it differently. Maybe in one show, there was something you found funny in that one episode of that one show that maybe they didn't find funny, or they found funny in a different way. A sense of humor is part of your personality. And if everybody has their own personality, then everyone has their own sense of humor. And it's all just about how you process thoughts and ideas and what you think is funny about an idea that somebody else might think is not funny, or just funny in a different way. It's kind of like the beauty of individuality. Just everybody, no one sense of humor is going to be exactly the same as another. Also,
and that's probably good. That's probably really
I think it's good. If I met two people who laughed in the exact same way at the exact same jokes, it'd be a little weird. It'd be like a Shining twin sisters kind of thing, where you're just like, you guys have to be a little different. Also, I completely relate to the idea of, and I think this is just like an experience everybody goes through, the truly hellish experience of thinking something is so funny and you show it to a friend or family member and they do not laugh at all. Like, I am obnoxious about sharing sketches and comedy and stand-up to people. I'm like, you gotta watch this, it's so funny. And so often I will just get nothing. And there's nothing, you can really hear the silence of making somebody watch a 2-minute sketch and they're not laughing at all. It's just like just like a miserable experience I think we all have to put up with. But yeah, it just goes to show that people are very unique in the way they process humor and the way that they process ideas.
I also wonder in regard to George Carlin, the thing that you were talking about in how he started as a comedian and how he has progressed over the years. I wonder if that was just a natural progression that he decided to go on in order to build up his rapport and credibility with the world that he was presenting to. Because and I don't know, could be just my assumption, but the way that I relate to it is, for example, when I meet person for the first time, I want to leave the best possible first impression. Now, I just show up as I am and I'll kind of speak whatever it is, but I'll still respect them, but I won't go into certain subject areas. Yeah. And I think the reason why I don't do that is because there isn't that pre-developed trust. There isn't that pre-developed level of comfort of what I may find funny, which I find a lot of things funny now, but someone else is like, wow, you really laughed at that. Which could also just be my voice, could just be my inner voice. There could be nothing true about it. And I wonder, in regard to your remark, how much of it is just a natural journey of what it means to be a comedian. And that's to almost go through a checklist. And that is, okay, I'm going to start off with this, develop the audience, develop the platform, and then from there go into other ones. It makes me think of Dave Chappelle. Mm-hmm. Dave Chappelle didn't start off talking about what he's talking about now. Yeah. I mean, literally, now he will pick any subject and he will say sometimes really absurd things. But like I find, some of them I find funny because I have a dark sense of humor. But then it's like, at the same time, it's like, he probably would not have been able to say this 20 years ago.
Yeah. And then, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, it's, regardless of whether or not you agree with somebody's sense of humor, for a professional comedian, there is I think prior to George Carlin, you didn't see a whole lot of people who progressed in the way that he did, because what he would do is actually something that most comedians find insane, which is he would develop an hour of comedy, he'd perform it for a couple of years, and then he'd get rid of the entire hour and just start fresh and just like develop a whole new hour and then do that hour the next year. And, most comedians hold on to their jokes, hold on to a certain amount of their jokes for their entire careers. They're never starting entirely fresh. So the idea that he would do that he he did a whole special about puppies or whatnot, and then he would completely abandon that material and move on to something else. It's a whole lot of. It takes a certain amount of bravery because everybody wants to have that, like, okay, I know this material kills, so I'm going to hold on to that. And you didn't really see that with him. Like, even to this day, you'll see some comedians, whip out a joke that they did 10 years ago, and he was very adamant about developing new material. So much so that if you watch all of his specials, you will rarely see a joke in one special that he did in a prior special. And that's very hard to do. Like, that is not easy to do. Like, it can take people a decade to come up with like one good hour of comedy. Wow. Or even like 5 minutes can take years. So the idea that like you'll be like, okay, let's try something new, that takes a certain amount of bravery. But I think for him is also just like, it's a life process. It's, okay, I feel this way about this. I feel, I've developed this thought about this. So it's definitely pushing boundaries in a way that requires a certain amount of courage. And speaking back to Dave Chappelle, yeah, he's making a lot of jokes now that, whether through courage, just the climate, I don't think he could have made 20 years ago. I think it's just a natural progression of him developing the confidence and the certain amount of courage to speak on issues that really matter to him, or it could just be something absurd. But it is, it's definitely it's called kind of finding your voice. They always say like comedians have to find their voice, and I think for both Carlin and Chappelle, it's been a long career of finding their voice to the point where they just feel comfortable talking about something, whether or not they know it's going to necessarily be funny or not. They're like, well, this is what I do. This is me. This is what I talk about. So, yeah, I think it is a natural progression. I think it's also just wanting to change, wanting to mix things up, to keep things fresh. But it does take a certain amount of bravery. So even if I don't always necessarily agree with the joke Dave Chappelle does, I do admire his journey that he's taken over the years to get to that point.
How do you deal with situations where you spoke briefly about the two techniques that you have? One technique being telling your own joke or something that you find funny, and then the other having a joke that you think the whole audience will absolutely just crack at. How do you deal with a situation if neither works? What do you do?
You know, that's interesting because I have been in situations where I've told a joke that I thought was like, you know, it doesn't make me laugh all that much, but it might be funny. And people really laughed at it. Or I've done a skit where I wasn't terribly confident in the idea of the skit, but people found it very funny. So yeah, there are breaks to the rule. Like if they laugh at it, like keep it. Even if you don't think it's a wonderful joke, you know, it's worth holding on to if it makes other people laugh. And it's interesting. Sometimes I think there's an instinct among some comedians to just hold on to a joke or an idea because you love it so much, even if it doesn't make the audience laugh. You want to keep trying it to make sure it works. What it makes me think of is, so one of my comedy friends and writing partners, we both have a very dark sense of humor. We did a skit a couple years ago that just involved picture two people in full chicken suits performing like chicken puns. And like, so basically it starts off like a really absurd comedy sketch. And then halfway through the sketch, one of the people in the chicken suits gets a phone call. And it's like a really devastating phone call. Like, I don't know, their house burned down or something.
Is it from a rooster or no?
Like like two people in chicken suits. And then they try to get back into the chicken routine, but they're clearly somewhere else now. So they're kind of like having a mental breakdown while trying to do the chicken routine. And she and I thought this was the funniest idea in the world. We love the idea of somebody having a mental breakdown in a chicken suit. And we just love the idea. And so we performed it one time and it did pretty well. Like it wasn't like the best skit in the whole show. But backstage, we're like, we're doing it again and we're trying it again. And the second time, no laughs whatsoever. Like nobody was buying this skit. And we just behind the scenes were laughing at the fact that we were laughing at it because we love this idea so much. So in terms of like I think it's important to trust your own sense of humor and to hold on to things. It's like maybe it's just not the right crowd or maybe they're just not getting it. So I think there is an importance of trusting your own sense of humor, but also like, you know, if you don't think it's funny and they think it's funny, you know, it's possible you're wrong. It's possible you're overjudging this skit and you are criticizing it too much and it's funnier than you think it is. So, you know, it's kind of a rule of thumb that the audience is kind of the final judge of whether it's funny. I don't think you should, you know, they say you have to do 100 times to know if it's really funny. But if after that 100 times nobody's still laughing, well, it's like the old writing term, kill your darlings. If it's not working, you just kind of have to know when to let it go. But you do kind of develop an instinct for knowing, okay, I think this is funny and they think this is funny, so I should probably hold on to it. But it's kind of a back and forth between you and the audience. So you just kind of have to feel it out a bit.
Mr. Mason, what are your thoughts?
I have to ask a question that switches the subject a little bit, but I'm curious about. Eddie Murphy in the 80s. He starred in this movie that made a huge amount of money called Beverly Hills Cop. And in it, he did this routine that was imitating a gay man. It was, in my opinion, very homophobic. Even then, it was really not appealing. People thought it was hilarious. That was acceptable at the time. But it was hard for me to believe that anyone thought that over time, considering the fact that people used to think that making fun of African Americans was just hilarious, or making fun of Asian people was just hilarious. Well, it wasn't funny then, and over time it became utterly socially unacceptable. Making fun of women just for being women used to be totally acceptable. Now it's not. I don't know. In my mind, I was thinking, well, that's the historical trajectory of how we find humor. What we find funny or not. What makes you think that people will be laughing at this and not judging you the same way they judged all of those jokes about African Americans many years ago? The same thing, by the way, is about people and their different physical sizes. People used to make jokes freely all the time about people who might have, who might different builds or different sizes. And now that stuff is really not funny. To what extent, Matt, do you think, or Oleg or anybody, think that when being humorous, there's a responsibility to be forward thinking about social changes and potential mores in the future with regards to your humor?
So
go ahead, Art.
I think for me, how I would answer that question is I think there's definitely a fine line between those things. I think I don't think that line is always as obvious, because then it's also in kind of to tag on to your question, it's to what extent do you choose to share your own personal experience as it relates to any of the social constructs or social issues or dilemmas that we have, and still making it as something that this is what you experienced. I know plenty of people who have gone through variety of transformations when it comes to their body image. I know plenty of people who have gone through so many different things. And then it just begs the question of, if you've been through it, do you have the right to speak about it? Do you have the right to share your own experience as it applies to a larger social issue of that time and day? And I don't know. I don't know if there is a fine line. And I don't know, just because you've lived through it, it gives you the right to be able to speak about those things. So I think there is, if anything, how I will answer this is that I believe, at least in my opinion, there is a level of awareness that I come to where I know that, okay, I've been through this experience, or I know someone who has, I can tell a story about it. I think the difference is using those issues in order to put people down, in order to shame someone based on their weight, in order to shame someone based on X, Y, and Z. I think that's a different story. But I think that somehow finding a creative way to bring those into a conversation or a discussion, this, once again, this is just my personal opinion, and maybe that this is just my sense of humor. And if you choose to judge me, well, that's your journey to go on, not mine. But but that's what I think. It's just, I think there are certain situations, unless I know some sort of direct experience, and unless I know how to craft a story that doesn't put the people down and what's the right word? Marginalize them even more, then I think I find it, I don't know. I find some acceptable being around it. But that's a really difficult question. It's a really difficult question, because once again, even in that case, if you experience X, Y, and Z, why does that give you the platform to share on behalf of everyone else who experiences that?
Yeah, it's interesting, because what it makes me think about is, there's this whole debate now. Like you'll see kind of older comedians, whether it be like Jerry Seinfeld or Chris Rock, talking about like, oh, it's so hard to play colleges nowadays because the kids are all so sensitive. I'm like, well, are they oversensitive, or do they just have a different standard of decency than maybe you did back in the day? And maybe your jokes about gay men are not flying at these colleges because they don't believe in making fun of gay men. Because why would you? It's a mean, cruel thing to do. And I think there's still that streak in comedy of, well, the cruelty is part of my edginess. Like there's this whole idea of like edginess, like, oh, I'm edgy, I push the boundaries. And I think there's a difference between wanton cruelty and pushing the boundaries. Like I don't believe, because you can't police humor. You can't like put a law in the book saying you're not allowed to make fun of this.
Right.
Well, I think you really have to look at yourself and say, why am I choosing to make fun of this? What's my investment in it? What is the point of doing this? It's kind of like, if you want to do cruel jokes and make fun of people, you have the right to do that. But you have to be willing to deal with the consequences of that, which is oftentimes, at these colleges, a bad response, because you're not updating your 30 or 20-year-old jokes to college kids who are probably going to have a different sentiment than you did back in the day. Like, I feel like you don't have to update your jokes, but you can't complain when your old jokes don't get a good response with a younger audience. I think you have to be, it's like any good comedian is going to be in touch with the time. So if you're telling your jokes you wrote in 1984 in 2021 at a college, how well do you think it's going to go? So no, I don't. While I don't think it should be quote unquote like illegal to make fun of anything, I also don't believe in being cruel. So I believe and there's also this rule in comedy called punching up. You generally want to punch up at people, like you punch up at politicians or super powerful people. So the idea of punching down is making fun of people who are disadvantaged or who are marginalized. And generally it's not good, it's not good practice to do that, because you're just making fun of people who are dealing with a lot of things, who are dealing, know your audience, exactly. And I don't know, I've never really found the appeal of being cruel to people who are dealing with enough in their lives, whether it be gay men or the Black community. I don't know. I've never really found the appeal of doing that. I mean, some people, maybe that's what they do, but my point is, I don't think you're allowed to get upset if you get a bad response to your old jokes that you haven't taken the time to update. So I don't think it's hard. Like, people, so like Chris Rock and Jerry Seinfeld say things like it's hard to be a comedian nowadays. I don't think it is. I think it's hard to be a lazy comedian. I think it's hard to be a comedian who is not putting in the effort to update your material to really think about whether this works anymore, or whether it should work anymore, or whether it should have worked back then. Back then, Scott, that joke about the impression of the gay man, maybe back then it felt like it was funny. It felt like it was okay to laugh at it. Maybe it requires people thinking maybe it wasn't, because we know it wasn't. We know it's not okay to make fun of a gay man like that. And you just kind of it requires a real reevaluation of what you've been brought up to believe. Yeah. And that's not always easy for people to do, to think, oh, maybe I was wrong. It's hard to admit when you're wrong, but if you want to improve as a person, you kind of have to be willing to accept that.
One of the things that I love about this show, Matt, and this happened last week with our special guest who talked to us about art, is that the conversations that we have can be lighthearted, they can be serious, they can be about any number of topics, but they always seem to ultimately, and maybe it's due to the quality of guests that we're bringing onto this show, which I consider you of that order, they bring these specific topics into something bigger and often reframe them. The concept of, well, maybe you need to view humor as something that you yourself need to update. Maybe there's laziness within humor. Maybe there's intellectual laziness. Maybe you need to use the reaction that people have to your humor or not, particularly if it's suddenly making you seem out of touch, as a chance to reframe where you are standing within our culture and what your behavior's implications were. That's a very, very interesting and useful reframe that I had never thought of before. And that ultimately, interestingly enough, is one of the goals of this show, to have conversations that enable us and those that are watching or listening to view the world and our experience and our thinking through a different lens. And you just gave me that gift, and I want to thank you for that.
Of course, Scott.
Yeah, the way you brought the insights, I think it was powerful how you were able to share these stories, we went on a fart tangent, or maybe not. Maybe that was part of the topic. Like,
it was only like 20% fart.
Yeah, it was only 20% farts. But at the same time, it's funny because it's a human experience that, agree or disagree, maybe all of us experience. How we process it, obviously, it's different. But still, it's funny because that's an example that I find to be funny. So that, going back to Scott's point, like what makes something funny and when do you choose not? That is an example that I find hysterical because everyone does it and everyone does it differently. Some do it like the next door neighbor can hear it. Others, it's like a mouse wouldn't be able to hear what just happened. And some smell, others don't. So there's just such a variety. And I think that's something I just want to thank you for doing. And as a token of our appreciation, what I want to do is just briefly create a space for you, Matt, as far as how do people find you? Where can people learn more about your work and anything that you have coming up in the is it the Zoom world or is it the in-person world?
Well, the comedy scene in New York is very kind of up in the air right now. A lot of theaters aren't open, things like that. I was telling Scott, my sketch group was attempting to do a show, and unfortunately we couldn't because of an accident at the theater. But so for now, my sketch group is called The Walking Juxt, Juxt. We're on TikTok. We do kind of like video sketches there. I also have a TikTok that I'm trying to get off the ground. It's just like silly videos. I'm on Instagram under Blonde One. I think BLOND1ONE. Blondie was my nickname in high school, not because I resembled a singer at all, just because I'm blonde. And I have a Twitter as well. I believe it's also let's see. No, but sorry. My Twitter tag is his name is Fay. I should know that. I'm on Twitter. Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I'll get a website up eventually. But right now, with me and the group are just figuring out our plans. So no live shows at the moment. But if you want to see some kind of funny, quirky sketch comedy, you can definitely tune into our TikTok and our Instagram, and you can probably enjoy some stuff there.
Mr. Mason, where can people laugh with you, not at you?
Well, they can always laugh at me too. PurposeHighway.com. PurposeHighway.com. Scott Mason's Purpose Highway is the name of my podcast. The theme is a movement for those who are seeking meaning. And if I might, this week, as many of you who read the newspapers know, the Taliban retook Afghanistan after more than 20 years of post 9/11 warfare with the United States and after having been driven out. This week's episode is the story of a man who shares his experience during the first takeover of the Taliban, of Afghanistan by the Taliban when he was a child. He talks about what it was like to grow up in an environment where fun was forbidden and belief was mandatory, his family's desperate attempt to escape, and how it impacted his soul, his psyche, and his view of religion itself.
Wow.
It's one of the most compelling episodes and timely, considering the news events that I've ever had the privilege of doing. And so if anyone is listening to this, the guest name is Hamid Murad, and it's a searing hour. Oleg, how can folks and people and other sentient beings, including aliens, find out about you?
That is a great question. Aliens part, I don't know how they can tune in, but maybe they have the same capabilities that we do. But it's primarily through the organization that I started and that you're a part of, Scott and
Yes.
Casey and so many other people. And that's Overcoming Odds. And for anyone that's listening, and if it's their first time hearing about it, what this is honestly a space for people to be able to share their own obstacles and share the lessons and the takeaways that they've learned from it. I'm a huge believer in that. I think that many times in life, I've been given cards that I wasn't necessarily the one that chose or picked them. But I think what I've been able to do is figure out ways to reshuffle that deck to get a new set every single time. So that's one thing. One space. The other one is called the Power of Your Story. Similar space, focus on one's individual personal narrative. So the story that you're telling yourself right now of why you think you can or you can't. And those are two platforms that I'm pretty active on. But outside of that, I wanted to do, and I know Scott and Matt, you were a part of this as well. I want to just briefly dedicate 30 seconds or so to one of the people who used to be a part of this show. Her name is Jolene Damian.
Yeah.
She was a pretty frequent guest, and I don't know the full details. Maybe Scott, you can fill in the blanks here, but she is no longer here with us. She has passed somewhat recently, and so as a token of our appreciation to her and contribution and just the incredible person that she was, we wanted to just hold a couple seconds of silence just for her and her family and everyone else that's a part of that journey.
Yeah. I just have to say, seeing that, it's very painful. Jolene was in her early 30s and she had children. This is the perfect episode for us to have given a tribute to her. Not only was she someone that overcame odds, but she was genuinely hilarious. She really was.
Yeah.
And she would have been laughing away with us if she could have been. The world has a lot less laughter because she's no longer in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was an exceptional person, and just someone who always showed up to the show and contributed her insight. So I just want to thank her for that, and thank anyone else. And I think if anything else, maybe somehow tying it back to the topic of our conversation today, is that obviously we don't know the full reasons behind her passing, but what I've realized is that taking life so seriously all the time maybe is not the ultimate answer. Maybe finding the funny moments is one of the ways to add more meaning and purpose. So I want to thank everyone who's been a part of this. I want to thank the two of you who have done everything that you can, and everyone that's listening. We look forward to seeing you next Thursday.